to the deep dive. You guys shared some seriously heavy sources this time.
Oh, yeah.
We're diving into World War I, like the whole
A
thing.
big one.
And honestly, it's kind of daunting. So many threads, so many players, such a massive impact.
It's definitely one of those turning points in history that echoes even today.
Exactly. So our mission here, right, is to cut through that complexity.
Right, to the core.
Yeah, we want to understand, like, the real drivers, the key dynamics, those pivotal moments that defined this conflict.
And I think to really get a handle on it, we need to start with, well, who are the main players?
Exactly. Because you've got, on the one hand, you've got the Allies. We're talking Britain, France, and Russia, at the outset anyway.
Yeah, the original crew.
And then later on, Italy and, of course, the U.S. jump in, which, spoiler alert, kind of shifts things a bit.
Game changer.
Big time. And then facing off against them, we have the Central Powers.
So that's Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria.
Quite a lineup. But it wasn't just about numbers, right? I mean, each side had some serious strengths going into this thing.
Oh, absolutely. So for the Allies, one big advantage was their naval power. I mean, the British Navy in particular was just dominant.
Ruling the waves.
Exactly. And that meant they could control the seas, enforce blockades, which was a huge deal when it came to resources and supplies.
Makes sense. Kind of hard to fight a war if you can't get what you need.
Yeah, and in a long-term conflict, that kind of advantage can really wear down an opponent. Plus, the Allies just had a larger overall pool of resources and industrial capacity. More manpower, more factories, more money to throw at the war effort.
So they have the staying power, you might say. But the Central Powers, they weren't exactly slouches, right?
Not at all. I mean, they had some seriously strong armies. Germany, especially, was known for its military prowess.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Precisely. Very disciplined, very well equipped, and they had some, cutting-edge military thinking at the time. Plus, their geographic location was a real asset. They were centrally located, so they could move troops and supplies more quickly between the eastern and western fronts.
Yeah.
Kind of like a hub,
Right, so that they had interior lines, shorter distances to cover. But here's the thing that to me is just wild. Both sides, at the outset, they were convinced this would be a quick war.
It's almost unbelievable looking back now.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Like, everyone was picturing a decisive victory, maybe in a few months, maybe even by Christmas of 1914.
Yeah, this idea of a short war was so pervasive. You see it in the letters, the diaries, the news articles from the time.
And of course, we know how that turned out. So what went wrong? What changed that whole optimistic outlook?
Well, several things, but a huge factor was technology. Specifically, the rapid evolution of military technology that really tipped the scales in favor of the defense.
Yeah, this is where the machine gun enters the picture, right?
Exactly. Now, machine guns weren't brand new, but they had become significantly more reliable and deadly, capable of just mowing down attacking troops. And then you add to that the widespread use of barbed wire, which was simple but incredibly effective at slowing down and channeling enemy advances.
So picture this. You're a soldier trying to advance across open ground, and you're met with a wall of bullets from these machine guns while getting tangled up in barbed wire. It was just absolute carnage.
Yeah, for the first time, the ability to inflict casualties far outpaced the ability to maneuver effectively. And that, in a nutshell, is why those initial offensives, those grand sweeping movements that everyone expected, they just ground to a halt.
Which brings us to the stalemate, the trench warfare that became the defining image of World War I. And I mean, we're talking hundreds of miles of interconnected trench systems. Can you even imagine?
It's hard to fathom the scale of it. These weren't just ditches. I mean, they were complex networks of fortifications, often just a few hundred yards apart, constantly under artillery fire, and the threat of enemy attack was ever present.
And you have to think about the conditions those soldiers were living in. The dampness, the mud, the disease, the rats. It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, the psychological and physical toll was immense. The constant fear, the shelling, the lack of sleep, the terrible food. It's almost impossible for us to truly grasp what they went through.
And what's really striking is how this war, fought primarily in those muddy trenches, had such a profound impact back home. Like, the whole fabric of society was being stretched and reshaped.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't have a conflict of this magnitude without it affecting every aspect of life. And one of the most significant changes was the role of women.
Right, because with so many men off fighting, women had to step up and fill the gaps in the workforce.
Exactly. And they did it in a huge way. Millions of women entered factories producing munitions, weapons, uniforms, all the things needed to keep the war machine running.
They took over jobs that were traditionally seen as men's work.
Yeah, and they proved they were more than capable. They worked in offices, managing the logistics of the war. They kept the farms going, ensuring the food supply. Their contributions were absolutely vital.
And it wasn't just in civilian roles either. Women served in the military as nurses, ambulance drivers, and in various support roles.
Right, their presence in these traditionally male-dominated spaces really challenged those old societal norms and assumptions about women's capabilities.
It's like the war, in a way, forced society to acknowledge the strength and resilience of women.
In a sense, it was a catalyst for social change.
Absolutely. And then there's the economic side of things. I mean, wars are expensive, right?
Yeah.
The World War I was on a whole other level.
Yeah, the scale of the conflict, the need for weapons and supplies, it just strained economies to the breaking point.
So what happened? How did governments cope with this massive demand?
They had to get directly involved. I mean, the old laissez-faire economics, the idea of minimal government interference, that just went out the window.
So more control, more regulation.
Exactly. Governments started controlling key industries, setting production quotas, managing the workforce. They had to make sure the war effort was properly resourced.
And that wasn't all. I mean, think about the shortages, the lack of food and fuel. That affected everyone.
Right, and that's where rationing comes in. Governments had to implement strict controls on essential goods.
So you're talking about ration books, limits on how much people could buy.
Exactly. It was a way to ensure that everyone got their fair share, that the war effort was sustained.
Wow. So we've got this incredibly brutal stalemate on the battlefields, massive social and economic upheaval back home. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of some seriously ambitious military strategies.
Yeah, and we can't talk about strategy without mentioning the Schlieffen Plan. I mean, this was Germany's grand plan to win a quick victory.
Their knockout punch.
Yeah, the idea was to avoid a two-front war, which was a nightmare scenario for Germany. So they planned to knock out France quickly by invading through neutral Belgium.
A bold move.
Very bold. They wanted to bypass those heavily fortified French defenses along the German border and just go right for the heart of France.
So capture Paris, force a French surrender, then turn their attention to Russia.
Precisely. But the problem was, it didn't quite go according to plan, did it?
Not exactly. They ran into some serious resistance. The Belgians put up a much tougher fight than expected. The French mobilized quickly, and the German logistics, well, let's just say they were stretched thin.
Yeah, that rapid advance created its own set of problems, and ultimately, they couldn't quite pull it off.
Which brings us to the Battle of the Marne. This was a turning point.
Oh, absolutely. This is where the French and British forces managed to halt that German advance. They stopped them just east of Paris.
So close.
So close. And that basically marked the end of mobile warfare on the Western Front. From this point on, it was trench warfare, stalemate, and just brutal attrition.
So both sides dig in, build these elaborate trench systems, and the Western Front becomes this nightmarish landscape of mud, barbed wire, and artillery.
And the casualties, I mean, it's hard to even comprehend the scale of the losses in those offensives.
You're talking about hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of casualties. And for what? A few yards of ground.
Exactly. It was just this senseless slaughter. And then you add to that the horrors of new weapons like poison gas.
Can you imagine the terror of that? Just this invisible cloud of death rolling through the trenches.
It was a horrifying new dimension of warfare. Blinding, choking, burning. It added a whole new level of psychological trauma to an already horrific experience.
And then there were tanks. I mean, they were supposed to be this game changer, right? Break through the trenches and the stalemate.
Yeah, the idea was there, but the early tanks, they were slow, unreliable, often broke down. They had some impact, but not the decisive breakthrough everyone was hoping for.
So the Western Front was this brutal stalemate. But what about the Eastern Front? Was it the same story?
Not entirely. The Eastern Front was more fluid, more dynamic. There was more movement, larger territorial gains and losses.
So less trench warfare.
Yeah, partly because the geography was different, more open spaces, and partly because the Russian army was, well, less technologically advanced than the Western powers.
But they still played a major role in the war.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the size of the Russian army was a constant threat to the Central Powers. And there were some major battles on the Eastern Front, like the Battle of Tannenberg, where the Germans inflicted a crushing defeat on the Russians.
Okay, so the war is raging on multiple fronts. And it's not just the original players anymore, right?
No, the alliance has expanded. The Central Powers gained Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire.
Which opened up new fronts in the Balkans and the Middle East.
Right. And on the Allied side, Italy jumped in, hoping for some territorial gains after the war.
And Japan joined the Allies. mainly to seize German colonies in Asia. And this brings us to the Middle East. I mean, this is where things get even more complex, right? You've got the Ottoman Empire, the Arab Revolt, figures like T.E. Lawrence.
Yeah, Lawrence of Arabia. He was a British officer who played a key role in supporting the Arab uprising against the Ottomans.
It's fascinating how these local conflicts got tangled up in the larger war.
It added a whole new dimension to the conflict, with long-term consequences for the region.
And then there was Gallipoli.
Oh, Gallipoli. This was a disaster, really. A failed Allied attempt to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war.
It was Churchill's idea, wasn't it?
Yeah, he was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, and he championed this plan to capture the Dardanelles Strait, which would open up a supply route to Russia.
But it went terribly wrong.
Yeah, poor planning, logistical nightmares, fierce Ottoman resistance. It was a costly failure for the Allies.
And then on the Western Front, you've got these battles that have become almost synonymous with the horrors of World War I.
The Verdun.
Just unimaginable brutality. Verdun especially was this grinding, attritional battle that lasted for months.
The Germans wanted to bleed the French army dry, right? Break their will to fight.
Exactly. And they came close, but the French held on despite suffering massive casualties.
And the Somme, that was another one of those horrific battles of attrition. Over 1 million casualties for minimal gains. It's a stark reminder of the futility of these large-scale offensives against entrenched positions.
And then, of course, there's the naval war. I mean, the British blockade of Germany was really effective, wasn't it?
Extremely effective. It choked off Germany's access to vital resources, food, raw materials.
And the Germans responded with unrestricted submarine warfare.
Yeah, they basically said, if you're going to blockade us, we're going to sink any ship that enters the war zone, regardless of nationality.
Which led to the sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner.
A tragedy that killed over 1,000 people, including Americans.
And that really ramped up tensions between Germany and the U.S.
Definitely. It was a major turning point in American public opinion.
And then there was the Zimmermann telegram.
Oh, that was a bombshell. The Germans basically proposed a secret alliance with Mexico against the U.S.
And that, combined with the unrestricted submarine warfare, was the final straw for the Americans.
Yeah, they declared war on Germany in April 1917.
And that was a game changer.
Huge. I mean, the U.S. brought fresh troops, resources, industrial might. It tipped the balance in favor of the Allies.
So looking back at all of this, I mean, it's just mind-blowing how much happened, how this war that was supposed to be over in a few months turned into this global conflict that lasted for years, reshaped the world, and caused so much suffering.
It's a stark reminder of how easily miscalculations can be made, how quickly things can spiral out of control.
And how important it is to really understand the forces at play, the potential consequences of our actions.
Especially when you consider how technology can change the game, how unforeseen events can disrupt the best-laid plans.
It's a lesson that's as relevant today as it was a century ago.
Absolutely.
Food for thought. Thanks for diving in with us.
Anytime.